A flurry of activity at the State House to wrap up 2024. Ahead on Face the State, one more week to go in the so-called lame duck session of the Ohio General Assembly. Lawmakers working on a heavy load of bills. We have analysis from political science professor David Niven on the workings of the legislature as the end of the year approaches. Plus, the Trump tariff plan. The president-elect promises to put tariffs on goods from the U.S.'s major trading partners. Why a nonpartisan think tank likes part of the proposal but is wary of other parts. Plus, joy and relief. Syrian refugees in central Ohio celebrate the beginning of a new era. Their home country finally out from under the thumb of a brutal dictatorship. Hear what the end of the Assad regime means to them. Thank you for joining us for Face the State. I'm Doug Petcash. A whole new General Assembly begins in January. If bills don't make it through the House and Senate this coming week, the sponsors will have to start over in the new year. So there is a lot going on, and quickly, at the State House. We've been following the big issues, including one bill that's causing concern among the LGBTQ+ community. House Bill 8, known as the Parents' Bill of Rights, looks to change the way schools interact with parents. Critics of the bill say it targets LGBTQ+ youth, but those who support it say it's about parents being more involved in their child's education. The bill is focused on schools communicating more with parents when it comes to their child's physical and mental health. 10 TV's Tara Jabbour has both sides of the debate.
I'm going to call this meeting of the Senate Education Committee to order. Will the clerk please call the roll?
House Bill 8, also known as the Parents' Bill of Rights, would make changes for all Ohio schools. First, it would make sure that sexuality content is age appropriate and developmentally appropriate.
We wanted to make sure that the language in this was correct and protected parents and schools.
The wording of sexuality content concerns some. Dwayne Stewart, the executive director of Equality Ohio, says this bill reminds him of the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida.
What ends up happening is just an immediate erasure of LGBTQ people, their families.
If passed, it would also notify parents of any change in student services like counseling or anything to do with physical or mental health. It would also require schools to tell parents if healthcare services are offered at the school. Stewart believes this could be dangerous for LGBTQ youth who confide in school professionals about their sexuality.
The teacher would have to inform a parent about a student's sexuality or gender identity, which is forced outing and will be dangerous, very dangerous for LGBTQ youth.
The legislation also mentions school staff should encourage students to not withhold anything from their parents. Senator Brenner says the changes made to this bill have been a lot, but necessary.
We've had multiple hearings on this to make sure that the process is done right and correctly, and that there's plenty of input on the bill, and I think that's where we are. We're basically ready to go, I believe.
It's such a blatant First Amendment violation for both students and teachers, and this is what our legislature is choosing to spend their time on.
If it doesn't pass next week through both the Senate and House, then lawmakers will have to start over next year.
We will see what happens between now and next week.
Also included in that bill, a provision that would require school districts to allow students to go to off-campus Bible study during school hours. We'll keep track of this legislation and keep you updated on what happens with it next week. The Ohio House passed a bill allowing universities to pay a student athlete directly for name, image, and likeness. House Bill 660 passed unanimously and now moves to the Senate. Lawmakers say it will help Ohio universities compete in the new era of paying student athletes. When they introduced the bill back in August, the co-sponsors said it will allow universities, the nonprofit collectives that raise money to pay athletes, and the student athletes themselves to work directly together through the process of making a deal. They say it will also protect student athletes and erase gray areas when it comes to negotiating NIL deals. The Republican and Democratic leaders in the Ohio House say the bill will make sure Ohio universities have a level playing field with other schools across the country.
It's important for, our colleges, universities in Ohio, and for our students to be able to be on the forefront of that and to make sure that we can be competitive.
Do you think it's a good thing for a university to be able to directly pay
Well,
student athletes?
I think that, in light of, I'm not going to get into the weeds of that, but I think that us having the ability to work within where we are going and where all states are going to have to go is a good thing.
Now, just last month, Governor Mike DeWine signed an executive order allowing Ohio universities to provide direct compensation to their student athletes for the use of their name, image, and likeness. Speaker Stevens said it's important the legislature make it a law. Right now, leaders are also waiting on final court approval of a settlement agreement between the NCAA and several athletic conferences that will allow schools to pay players. And just to be clear, the bill and the executive order prohibit universities from using fees or tuition paid by students or state tax money to pay student athletes. Again, the bill now goes to the Senate. It has to be passed by the end of the year, or lawmakers would have to start from scratch. Ohio lawmakers are debating whether to give themselves a bigger pay raise than they are currently set to receive. This would also include many other elected officials across the state. Republican State Representative Bill Seitz told me it's about keeping up with inflation. Right now, elected officials are scheduled to get a 1.75% raise per year through 2028. The proposal would raise that to 5% each year for the next 4 years. Then for the next 6, it would be the rate of inflation or 3%, whichever is lower. Why is this needed now?
We've had 4 or 5 years of rampant inflation. As anyone knows, prices are up somewhere between 20 and 30% over where they were pre-pandemic.
The proposal would not only apply to legislators, but also countywide elected officials, township trustees, judges, legislators, and statewide office holders. According to the state, legislators currently make just over $71,000 a year. Those in leadership positions, such as the Speaker of the House, make more. The governor, attorney general, and state Supreme Court justices earn roughly between $120,000 and $180,000. What do you say to those who would say, hey, I can't vote myself a raise? Why should you be able to do that?
Well, there's only one group that can vote the raise for the legislature, and that's the legislature, okay? So it can't be done any other way.
Citizens we talked to are skeptical.
I feel like they already make enough, to be honest, and there's a lot of local residents who would love even just to make minimum wage.
The people that deserve to get a pay raise are the people that keep this beautiful hallowed hall clean.
Right now, discussions on the pay raise are still going on, and a bill has not yet been introduced. A lawmaker told me that could happen this week, but lawmakers would have to pass the bill this week or start over next year. The 135th Ohio General Assembly wraps up its business this coming week, and joining me to break down what lawmakers have been doing is University of Cincinnati political science professor David Niven. David, thanks again for being here today.
My pleasure.
Well, first of all, what do you make of this raise proposal?
Well, one hand, this is a group of folks who work part-time who are already being paid more than the average income of an Ohioan. That's a fact. On the other hand, of course, as Representative Seitz said, yes, there's inflation, and inflation has been higher than their rate of pay. But it doesn't sound the most attractive thing to say to voters. Right before we head out the door, we're raising our pay. And do you think that this will pass? I mean, they've had these discussions before. In 2018, Governor Kasich even vetoed it, and then they overrode that. This is not so much a question of what they want to do, it's a question of what they have time to do. So, if this issue doesn't pass, in the remaining week or so, it's likely to come up again next session. Come up again, okay. So far in the lame duck session, the Republican-dominated legislature has passed the so-called bathroom bill that requires students to use the bathroom or locker room of the gender assigned at birth. It now looks like the Parents' Bill of Rights that we talked about earlier in the show will pass as well. And then earlier this year, the law took effect that bans gender-affirming care for minors and also bans transgender athletes from competing in women's and girls' sports. In school sports. Why do you think there is such a focus on this type of legislation? Is this something that is just Ohio? Well, this is an awful lot of legislating affecting an awfully small population of people. In that respect, it's extraordinary. This is really following a playbook we've seen in Florida and a handful of other states where Republicans have had supermajority control of the legislature and a supportive governor. And what's extraordinary about it is continuing to return to this question in what has otherwise been a very unproductive session of the legislature. This is a legislature that's historically passed far fewer bills than would be the norm, and an awful lot of those bills are focused on a very small handful of people.
Why do you think it's been so unproductive, or can you
Sure.
can you qualify that for me?
Well, basically what you have here is you have total Republican control, but you have two different branches of Republican thought. And it's not so much that they disagree about what to do, they disagree about what to do first. And so there's been a bit of an ongoing feud between, House Republicans and Senate Republicans, and, bills relating to sexual orientation and sexual identity, one of the few things they've agreed on. And obviously that's been, an ongoing theme here.
You talk about productivity overall over this
Right.
2-year General Assembly being low. We get to these lame duck sessions, and then it's just this flurry or frenzy of activity, if you will. Is that usually the case?
It is. It's almost always the case. You get to this lame duck session, and it's like one of those game shows where they set people loose in the supermarket. Anything they can grab in 2 minutes, they get to keep. That's what the legislature does. It just goes into a frenzy. There's no time for full hearings. There's no time for full debate. And one of their tactics is they tend to cram things into a bill. So they take separate ideas, put them into one bill.
They call them the Christmas tree bills.
They call them Christmas tree bills.
And decorate them, yeah.
And even the bill that you're already talking about that would require, parents to be informed of everything relating to, sexual curriculum. That bill includes a provision allowing release time for religious, education. In the same bill. It's a lot of different things going on.
You're very familiar with the state constitution too. Does this run the risk then of violating that concept of one subject per bill, or is it because they're education related it can get by?
Well, the short answer is Ohio has one of the very few clear provisions of the Ohio Constitution is a bill has to be about a single subject, one single subject, and that definition of single has been stretched and stretched and stretched, and it just keeps getting bigger. So we see an awful lot crammed into the concept of single subject.
When you see this happening so quickly, like you mentioned, no time for a bunch of hearings and really digging into these bills, does it raise the risk of mistakes that would then have to be fixed in the next General Assembly?
I mean, this happens all the time where they have to do, essentially a correction bill, a few weeks later when they realize some provision in the law had an unintended consequence. And, to give you an example, the religious release time would allow release time for any group that calls itself a religion. It doesn't specify, any standards of what those would be. So I could create a religion this afternoon and start pulling kids out of a school. So those kinds of things where they maybe haven't thought through all the implications of what they've done because they did them in such a hurry, they often come up again.
Let's look ahead a little bit. First of all, there's a change of power coming up. Jason Stephens, the current Speaker of the House, did not run again for re-election to that position. Senate President Matt Huffman, whom we have a picture of to show people here, is moving from President of the Senate to Speaker of the House next year. How much different do you think things will be for the way things are put through in the House under his leadership?
Well, superficially, you'd say, well, this is Republican control. It's continuing Republican control. It shouldn't make that big of a difference. But it's actually going to make a tremendous difference because Huffman and Stephens did not see eye to eye, even though they're both conservative Republicans. Stephens is a little bit more of an institutionalist, believes in things like infrastructure bills and so forth. Huffman was a harder push on all things culture. So the big difference is Huffman still runs one of the bodies, but he has a very friendly now leader in the Senate. So he'll be in charge of the House. He leaves behind a legacy in the Senate, and essentially one of his lieutenants is taking over. So they are going to march in lockstep.
And that being Senator Rob McCauley,
right,
taking over on that side. So
right.
We did see a lot of kind of disagreement on legislation and what maybe went through one chamber didn't go through the other. So you're seeing that won't be an issue this time.
Right. I mean, they are of one mind on priorities. And so this will be a really big sea change because ironically, what's happened in the last 2 years is Republicans have had so much power in Ohio that they've spent their time fighting with each other. And this really consolidates Huffman's ability to push a legislative agenda.
And do you expect under his leadership it to be more conservative, more moderate? How do you see that?
Well, it's already been conservative, but it'll be a bit more activist. That's the big difference. The agenda is not going to radically change. We're already talking about, sexual orientation, sexual identity bills. Those will keep coming, but it'll happen a lot faster and bigger. Huffman, his defining issues are all cultural conservative issues. Probably see a lot dealing with education from top to bottom, from elementary school to college.
What other issues do you see coming up in the next General Assembly, which starts in January?
Sure. I mean, in terms of categories of transformation, they're going to look at the tax code. They love the idea of cutting income taxes, which in Ohio effectively forces local governments to pay for more. So it's, there's no such thing as free lunch. There's no such thing as free police and schools and so forth. That will no doubt be a major thing. Another big issue to think about is Ohioans enshrined reproductive rights in the Constitution, but the legislature hasn't actually pushed any legislation forward consistent with the state constitution. That's going to be a big issue.
We hear a lot about property tax relief too, but or housing affordability,
right.
In those two things and how they intersect, but nothing much has happened this session.
Nothing much has happened, and that's at cross purposes with their desire to lower income taxes. If you lower income taxes, the hole that's created is almost, inherently lower. Local governments having to pay, local governments rely on property tax.
And we'll be watching it, of course, closely here on 10 TV. Just in the minute and a half or so we have left, David, I wanted to get your thoughts on the Trump transition. He's been naming, a lot of, he named the key cabinet posts,
Sure.
and now he's been naming the undersecretaries and the other positions in the administration. What do you make of how the administration is going out and going on so far in the transition in terms of, tone, selection, and whatnot?
Well,
and speed.
Sure. A couple of remarkable things. One is the degree to which, he's rating Fox News' personnel to fill, his various positions. People he's seen on television, people who've said supportive things. Second is almost the desire to create controversy. Typically, a president-elect selects people, who are of certain stature and who will make life easier in terms of getting Senate confirmations. What we've seen here is a pattern of choosing people almost, ready-made to create controversy and make it hard for the Senate to confirm. So, I think that's what's defined this early effort. It's been fast. It's been very, very public people, not a lot of obscure folks, and it's been a lot of controversial folks who don't actually have sort of the typical experience that one would expect of somebody who's going to run a cabinet agency or a major government office.
Well, they do have control of the Senate now, so we'll see how the confirmation
They have
hearings
control
go.
of the Senate, but they don't necessarily have 50 people who would rubber stamp anything.
Okay, we'll see how the confirmation hearings play out. David Niven, thank you so much for your time today. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Well, still ahead on Face the State, President-elect Trump says he's a big believer in tariffs, why he says they are needed, and why a nonpartisan think tank agrees with part of his plan, especially the part geared toward China. Plus, joy along the streets of Dublin over something that happened thousands of miles away. Syrian refugees in central Ohio celebrate a power shift they thought might never come. Welcome back to Face the State. President-elect Donald Trump will be inaugurated as the 47th President of the United States on Monday, January 20th. Once in office, he says he will impose tariffs on the three biggest trading partners of the United States: China, Canada, and Mexico. Here's part of what he said about his tariff proposals in an interview on Meet the Press.
I'm a big believer in tariffs. I think tariffs are the most beautiful word. I think they're beautiful. It's going to make us rich. We're subsidizing Canada to the tune of over $100 billion a year. We're subsidizing Mexico for almost $300 billion. We shouldn't be subsidizing. Why are we subsidizing these countries? If we're going to subsidize them, let them become a state. We're subsidizing Mexico, and we're subsidizing Canada, and we're subsidizing many countries all over the world. And all I want to do is I want to have a level, fast, but fair playing field.
Trump says he plans to impose 60% tariffs on goods from China. The nonpartisan American Economic Liberties Project supports strong tariffs that are targeted at goods which the U.S. is also boosting domestic production of. Morgan Harper is the project's Director of Policy and Advocacy. She's based in Ohio.
So take, for example, like, semiconductor chips, EVs, if you have an industrial policy that is working to boost that domestic manufacturing, and you're simultaneously making the cost of bringing goods in from China for those same industries prohibitively expensive, well, then a company is going to have to start changing the way that they think about their supply chain and their production. And they will be incentivized towards supporting and buying from more domestic producers so that they don't have to pay those tariffs.
However, the American Economic Liberties Project is wary of across-the-board tariffs that don't target specific goods. Harper says they're concerned the proposed tariffs for Canada and Mexico don't have a domestic production strategy, and that could lead to higher prices for consumers and do nothing to help U.S. workers.
You're really risking a lot of retaliation from these countries, and we depend on Mexico and Canada in particular of taking a lot of our exports, like in agricultural goods, for example. So, the impacts there are just it seems more likely. I should say a lot of this is a bit unpredictable to exactly forecast how it'll all play out. But the idea of having 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada just seems, like a recipe for increasing prices without a real plan for how that's going to even potentially improve the outcomes for workers and communities at the local level.
Many economists have said the tariffs will lead to higher prices for consumers. Trump says he doesn't believe that. He says tariffs are a powerful tool when properly used. Coming up on Face the State, a feeling of hope. Syrian refugees in central Ohio look forward to the possibility of experiencing their home country in a way they never had before, with freedom from a harsh regime. Hear from them next. A week ago today, rebels swept into Syria's capital of Damascus, ending the Assad family's 50 years of iron rule. Former President Bashar al-Assad fled the country. Russia confirmed it has granted him asylum. That day, thousands of Syrians poured into the streets with celebratory gunfire, joyful after a stifling, nearly 13-year civil war. Syrian communities in different countries celebrated the end of the regime, including right here in central Ohio. 10 TV's Carla Rogner came across a group of a few hundred people cheering with Syrian flags in Dublin. She has more on what this moment means to the local Syrian community.
Finally. While wrapping up a celebration at Dublin's Bridge Park, there is relief and joy from those in the Syrian community, especially from Dr. Rifat Mustafa.
I am here as a refugee because of Bashar al-Assad.
He left Syria with his family at the start of the civil war more than a decade ago, and he hasn't been back since.
Today, as we say in our language, Eid, it means a holiday in English. Today we have a holiday, a national day in Syria.
The impact of the 50-year reign of the Assad family spans across generations.
So this means like the beginning of the freedom.
Aya Al-Jabuli and Layla Al-Bawab remember fleeing as children.
When the thing started in Syria, we went out to protest, but they started to shoot us and they started to put the gun on our faces. And then I was a child and we had to run away.
Now they and many other young people look forward to the possibility of experiencing a country they've never had the privilege to feel free in.
Like, this is all we wanted from the beginning, but it happened. 14 years.
There is some uncertainty for what's to come in Syria's future, according to Rasha Al-Rifai, who organized this rally.
We're worried about the future.
But for now, there is celebration.
This is literally making history. We thought that we were going to be stuck with the Assad regime for the rest of our lives.
Several people Carla talked to say they are already planning trips back to their hometowns. They haven't been back in years because of concerns for their safety. That's all of our time for today. Thank you so much for joining me this week for Face the State. I'm Doug Petcash. I'll see you next Sunday at 11:30.